Welcome to episode 45 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Today, our focus is the knee, and we're calling this the ABCs of the knee. And for us, for Travis and me and this podcast, for us, ABCs, when we do these episodes that are ABCs, it stands for anatomy, biomechanics, and cueing. Isn't that kind of clever? So that's what we are focusing on today, the anatomy, the biomechanics, and the cueing of the knees. And our plan is to actually release 2 episodes in a row on the topic of the knee. Because it's actually there's a lot about the knee. It's a really big topic and really like a complex area of the body with a lot of directions you can go when you want to focus on it. So in order to make this a little more manageable, we decided that this first episode on the knee is just going to be more about like the foundation of the knee joint, the anatomy, how the knee moves, how we might think about moving and targeting the knee in like a yoga practice, in a strength training practice. And we also today are hoping to cover just some common knee conditions. For example, knee osteoarthritis is kind of a biggie, and we might have time to get to some others. And maybe we'll today get to some tips on how to kind of work around knee pain. If like in a yoga practice, for example, or a strength training practice, if you have knee pain or if you work with students who do. So that is our plan for today's episode. And then we will definitely, I'm sure we will hit naturally on some myths about the area of the knee, because that's kind of always tends to come up in our podcast episodes. Naturally, when you're kind of looking a little deeper at the science of these topics. But we have kind of reserved our second knee episode, which will be our next episode. That's going to be more dedicated to yoga myths about the knees. So that'll be more focused on that, but I'm sure we're going to talk about some. We can't help but talk about some myths today. And we also just wanted to make sure to mention that, today we may talk about some like knee conditions, like I said, like osteoarthritis, maybe injuries to the knee, things like that. And so Travis and I just want to make sure to remind everyone that nothing that we talk about today is medical advice. And while we're definitely talking from our experience and our understanding of like the scientific literature and what research suggests about these conditions, we're not off, like this is not medical advice, and you should certainly talk to or consult with your healthcare practitioner if you have any suspected knee conditions or issues going on. So we just wanted to lay that out. And then before we dive into the content of the ABCs of the knees, just a quick reminder about some ways that you can support Travis and myself and our work with the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast and leave us a rating or a review, and we so appreciate it when you have the time to do that for us. You can also stay on top of everything that's going on around here with me and with Travis and with our work via signing up for my email newsletter at jennirawlings.com/newsletter. And lastly, another way you can support us is to consider joining Travis and myself for our one-of-a-kind Strength for Yoga remote group training program. And that's a strength training program that we created specifically designed for yogis to make strength training accessible and relevant for this population. So you can use code podcast30 for 30% off your first month in our remote group training program. And the link to learn more and to sign up is in the show notes. Link to kind of everything I just said is in the show notes to this episode. So with all of that said, we're ready to talk about knees. And yes, Travis?
I think because this episode is the ABCs and next episode is the myths, we're going to have like a safe word or sound in case like a myth comes up, and then we'll save it for the next episode.
We're like, we can't talk about that now.
Mm-hmm.
That's really funny.
So we'll monitor each other.
Totally. We'll
police the podcast.
100%. Because we want to build, some suspense and some intrigue for the next podcast.
Totally.
Did you saw, Travis, how in my Facebook group, the Yoga and Movement Science Facebook group, which is this free private group on Facebook. Anyone can join. Great place to talk about all sorts of yoga geeky things like we talk about on the podcast. I threw out to that group a few days ago. I told them we were going to record an episode on the knees and just kind of solicited, does anyone have any questions, comments, or thoughts about the knees, and like in a yoga context or just a general context? And you saw how many people posted questions, right?
People want to talk about the knee.
It really surprised me. Yeah. It's kind of a big area of interest, apparently, right?
For sure. I mean, I have one, but most people
You
have two. I
have one knee.
One human and one robot knee.
That's right. But most people have two knees. And yeah, I mean, to be honest, like we were going to do this episode on the knee. And my original idea was it would just be one single episode. But because people seem so excited and enthusiastic about the topic, and there were so many varied questions, that's kind of, I think, what clued us into like, we should maybe make this a double 2 episode.
Yeah. Lest we record a 3-hour podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nobody listening by the end.
Totally. So that's kind of why we chunked it up the way that we did. And yeah, so today, for starters, we've got to, like, everybody knows what the knee is, right? And we've talked about the knee in plenty of our other podcasts. It's like an integral part of the body, so it naturally comes up. Right. But if we actually take a step back and really want to look specifically at the knee, and like that's the theme, we kind of got to start by looking at like, what's the structure of the knee? What's the anatomy of the kney, right? It's like, and it's kind of more complex than you might think, right?
Yeah. Well, especially if you think about it, it is a hinge joint, right? Sort of. We'll talk about that.
Yeah,
But the hinge joint would be the simplest type of joint, right? You're just, you might think you're just connecting two bones to each other. That's the joint. And then it just moves in one way. And that's kind of how some people think about it, maybe in those very simpler terms, but there's more to it than that.
There's more to it than that. I really like how you pointed that out. Yeah, for sure. Like the knee joint it's more than just where your femur or your thigh bone and then your lower leg, so the tibia, your main lower leg bone, it's more than just where those two connect, right? Because there's like, those are two bones, but there's another bone involved in the knee joint, right?
Which might not even be the bone that you're thinking of.
Totally. What's the third bone of the knee joint that I think most people think of the knee as being just two bones?
Right. So the patella or the kneecap is the missing link here. But you might have thought that we were going to say the fibula, which is the muscle of the lower leg.
Other bone of the lower leg.
Sorry, other bone. Yeah. And I might have thought that too until Jenni reminded me.
How you are reviewing for this episode.
Yeah. That the fibula doesn't actually connect to the knee joint at all. It connects to other stuff that connects to the knee joint.
That's right. But it's not technically part of the knee. Yeah. And just in case people don't know, so our lower leg, like the shin kind of casually, is actually made up of two bones, the tibia and the fibula. And the tibia is like the larger, kind of more weight-bearing bone of the lower leg. But then we have the fibula, that little guy there too. And the fibula is lateral, so kind of toward the outside. And it doesn't actually reach high enough to articulate with the femur. So it's not actually part of the knee joint. But like you said, it does serve as like an attachment point for muscles and ligaments that cross the knee joint. So it's, it's around the area.
It's not just hanging out, not doing anything.
That's right. It serves some roles. But yeah. And then another thing about the knee is that it's not just one joint. It's not just the knee joint, right? It's actually two joints. Yeah, I think it's two joints. Because so the main joint of the knee that I think most of us think about when we think about the knee is where the femur, the thigh bone, articulates with the tibia or the shin bone. And that is like maybe the main part of your knee, but that's actually just one of the two joints. So that's technically called the tibiofemoral joint, right? Tibia, femur, where they meet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we think of that's like the major knee joint, I guess, but there's technically another joint in there, and that's where the patella articulates with the femur, right?
Right.
And that's again your kneecap that kind of sits in front of the bottom of the femur, and
Mm-hmm.
that is called your patellofemoral joint. So yeah, so when you're talking about the knee and when you're thinking about the knee, there really are like those two distinct joints. And sometimes too, if you're thinking about, sometimes it helps to when you learn about a body part to kind of think about the conditions that can come up, or like the painful conditions or
Right.
injuries that might arise. At least I feel like I learn more about the body when I learn about those
Yeah.
things.
Well, and especially because those conditions are often named based on that anatomy. So like we might
Yeah,
talk about patellofemoral pain. Um,
exactly.
like, oh, if you've heard of that before, but maybe you never thought like, well, what is that referring to anatomically? And
That's
then,
right.
you can break it down, and then, oh, I know what the femur is. Oh, I know what the patella is. It's that floating bone there in front of the knee that we call the kneecap. So therefore
Hmm.
patellofemoral pain must be in that general vicinity, right?
Yeah, in that general vicinity of like the anterior knee or the front of the knee, like kind of the kneecap area. But you could
Mm-hmm.
also, for example, something like, and we're going to talk about like the meniscus, which is like this
Right.
fibrocartilage disc in the knee joint. And sometimes people can experience a tear or some sort of injury to that. And so when we're talking meniscus, that's actually not between the kneecap and the femur. That's actually between the femur and the tibia, right? So that's more the tibiofemoral
Yeah.
joint.
No anatomical cues from the name on that one.
Yeah. Tibiofemoral, you mean?
Yeah, well, meniscus doesn't tell you where it is. You
Oh,
just have
oh,
to know.
oh. That's right. I see what you're saying. Totally. You just kind of have to learn and memorize that one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've actually given a little preview to some other stuff we're planning to talk about with the knee. But what we just talked about, that kind of covers the main bones and the main joints of the knee, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what about Travis? We're going to talk about like how the knee joint moves, but maybe before that, we might want to talk about like some ligaments of the knee,
Yeah.
don't you think?
So so ligaments are passive restraints that help with bony congruency. Would you say that's a fair
Yes. Yeah, I really like
descriptor?
your
So
definition. Yeah.
it keeps the bones in place. It's not the only thing, you
Mhm.
got muscles and um,
Mhm.
other stuff that's holding it in
That
place.
holds things.
So
Yeah, yeah.
if the ligaments go, your knee doesn't. Well, if all of them go, I guess it could be bad. But if
Right.
one of them goes, you can sometimes still function without it, or at least long
Mhm.
enough if you decide to get it surgically repaired. But
Good
basically,
point.
if you think about there being roughly, not roughly, if you think about there being a front, back, and two sides of the knee, there
Yeah.
are equally that number of ligaments that kind of control the motion, or prevent excess motion in each
Mhm.
of those four directions. So we have the medial collateral ligament, the lateral collateral ligament. So that's inside and outside, respectively. And then we have the anterior cruciate and the posterior cruciate, which aren't exactly in the front and back. They actually go from front to back and back to front. But
Oh, right, right, right.
the cruciate part is actually what kind of tells you that. So cruciate
Mhm.
standing for crossing. So the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments kind of make this X, and the one prevents your tibia from moving excessively anterior, and that
Mhm.
relative to the femur, and that is the anterior cruciate ligament. And then the posterior cruciate ligament does the opposite. It prevents excessive posterior motion. Did I get that
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think yeah, at
So,
least to my
so
understanding, yes.
yeah, and there are other muscles that assist in preventing that excessive motion,
Mhm.
but those would be active restraints, and then the ligaments would be passive restraints.
Totally. And maybe just a couple other mentionings about those ligaments is you gave the great full names for all of them, but they're often like referred
Oh yeah.
to abbreviated, right?
Hmm.
So like the lateral collateral ligament is LCL and then medial
Yeah.
is MCL, right?
People have probably heard of all of these as MCL, LCL, ACL, and PCL,
That's
but
right.
maybe never knew or
Mm-hmm.
consciously remembered. Oh, LCL stands for lateral collateral ligament, and
That's
ACL
right.
stands for
That's right.
anterior cruciate ligament, and so on.
And then something that I think maybe is kind of geekily interesting about the ligaments of the knee is that the ACL and the PCL, the ones that cross, and you just described them, they are, I believe, they're considered intracapsular ligaments because they
Okay.
are within the joint capsule because they're really just kind of in there in the knee joint. Whereas the lateral and medial ones, they're extracapsular because they're on the outside. Do you know what I
I
mean?
never heard that distinction, but I get it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Totally. Just in helping to picture it, like the ACL and
Hmm.
PCL are kind of really within, like really inside the joint, inside the capsule. And the only other thing I'd mention, at least right now, about those ligaments is tell me if you agree, Travis, but like one of those four that you mentioned is probably the most famous one that most people have heard of all
Hmm.
those ligaments, the ACL.
I think so. I mean,
You,
I've single handedly tried to make it more famous.
you have because you have an actual another business that you run which helps people post ACL tears, right? It's like with after they've gone through ACL reconstruction surgery, right?
Hmm.
And then they
Hmm.
maybe need some help with their rehab, like a little further down the line. That's kind of where you come in with that service that you offer, which is very cool.
Yeah. So it's a business called ACL Care that I co-run
Mm-hmm.
with my friend who's a physical therapist. His name's Akil Piggott.
Mm-hmm.
And because rehabilitation from like A to Z can be up to like a year, people generally can't be in physical therapy for that long because their insurance runs out. Physical therapy kind of just doesn't last that long in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a smartphone app that helps people transition from kind of it's bridging that gap between rehabilitation and performance. So kind of that sweet spot of all right, early well early stage return to sport, but late stage physical therapy is kind of where it picks up and then gets you all the way ready to like high level speed, agility, landing, cutting, jumping, running, sprinting, all that sort of stuff.
Right, right. So if you happen to be someone with recovering from ACL surgery, or if you know someone who is, a good way to find you guys is on Instagram, right? At ACL
Mm-hmm.
Care Pro. Isn't that it? We'll put
That's
the
right.
link in the show notes, but it's like the handle is at ACL Care Pro. So check it out. Travis is fantastic with what he offers through that, with what he and Akil offer. So yeah, so those are ligaments, and then we wanted to touch on. There are actually a lot of muscles, and we're not going to talk about all of them. We just don't have time in this
You don't
episode. But
want to talk about the popliteus?
actually, I did kind of think that we may mention that little tiny knee muscle. Yes, maybe. But we've got kind of some bigger muscles of the knee that are probably more important for this conversation. What would you say is like the biggest muscle group we tend to think of when we think of the knee?
Definitely the quadriceps.
That's right. That's what I would say too.
Yeah.
Quadriceps. And
But maybe it
what
should
are
be the
what are they?
hamstrings.
Well, that's what I was mentioning to you.
Yeah.
Because people like we're going to talk about like how to strengthen the knee, but I think generally when you're wondering about that or you look that up online, like how do I strengthen my knee? You'll typically find a bunch of quadricep strengthening, right? That's like that's you seems to be what people picture when they think of knee strengthening. And then I asked you, Travis, well, the hamstrings cross the back of the knee, so technically couldn't hamstring strengthening also be considered knee strengthening, even though you don't tend to see that when you look up knee strengthening? What did you
Right.
say when I asked you that?
Well, it may be. So I think maybe it's because when you look down, you can see the front of your knee. And honestly, like I think it might be that simple. But for whatever reason, when we talk about knee strengthening and hip strengthening, I think we default to the joint action of extension for both of the joints. So it's
Mm-hmm.
easy
That's
to,
interesting.
yeah, it's just like, oh, knee strengthening, we must mean knee extension strengthening. Therefore, we're talking about the quads. And then for
Mm-hmm.
hip strengthening, oh, we must be talking about hip extension. Therefore, we must be talking about the glutes and the
The glutes.
hamstrings.
Mm-hmm.
But like you said, because the hamstrings do cross the knee, that leaves open room for strengthening the knee by working the hamstrings as well. So the joint
Yeah,
action that the hamstrings do is flexing or bending the knee. So any exercise where you're flexing the knee could be considered a knee strengthening exercise, even though it might not classically be thought of that way.
that's right. I'm glad you think that because that's kind of what I think too. And it's so like hamstring strengthening would be strengthening the knee from the backside, like the
Right.
posterior. And then quadriceps strengthening would strengthen the knee from the front side because they cross the
Yeah.
knee anteriorly.
Yeah, and it's just funny because when I learned these distinctions in personal training school, we talked about like knee dominant lower body exercises and hip dominant lower body exercises.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the knee dominant, we were usually referring to knee extension dominant. So we would say squats and lunges and step ups, and then the
Mhm.
hip dominant exercises we would say glute glute bridges and deadlifts and kettlebell swings. But then, like, well, what about leg curls? And
Wait,
it's
what and
like
what's the leg curl?
a leg curl
Just so
you could
people
do in
know.
a few different ways, but oftentimes you might see a machine at the gym where you're sitting or lying face down and you're pulling your heel towards your backside. So you're
Mhm.
bending your knee against resistance. Um, and
Hamstring
that
strengthener.
yeah, it's a hamstring strengthener, but is it hip dominant or knee dominant? It's really technically a knee dominant um, hamstring exercise.
Mhm.
But because we often tend to think of hamstring exercises as hip dominant because bridging and deadlifting or hip hinging and all those things are hip dominant exercises, it's just kind of, it's a little bit of a mind teaser. Maybe, at least it
Agree.
is to me.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I could totally see that. It's just yeah, it's, can be a little confusing, but just, I guess, for our purpose of today talking about the knee, if we're just thinking about, like, the directions of movement or the directions of
Hmm.
motion for the knee, I think that kinda maybe helps us tune in on what we might want to think about doing to, like, quote, "target the knee" or potentially strengthen.
Hmm.
So maybe we should talk about, like, the directions of movement, right?
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier, like we tend to think of the knee as a hinge joint, but like, is it only a hinge joint? Like, what's up with what does the knee do? How does it move?
Yeah. So it is a hinge. It's classified as a hinge joint, but it
Mhm.
also has some rotation. So we
Yes,
could
and
talk
I think
about the
oftentimes
hinging.
people don't realize that. Like, I just say
Yeah.
you might edit me and be like, "This is a yoga myth we're gonna talk about, like, in our next episode," but I know in the yoga world, there's a lot of fear-mongering around rotating the knee, like, you're doing something that's gonna rotate the knee, and that's gonna be bad for it because it's not designed to rotate, it only flexes and extends. Yeah.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a common caution. But I think what you're suggesting is like, well, the knee actually does rotate.
It
Like, it's
does
not
a
just a
little.
hinge joint. Yeah, right,
Yeah.
not a lot, yes.
Do you know how many
I
degrees?
read that it rotates up to 10 degrees.
I was
So
going to
not
guess 10.
huge, but you were you know.
I was. I was.
Yeah, so the knee does flex and extend, and that's like it bends and straightens if we're gonna talk more casual language, and that
Mhm.
action of flexion and extension, that's, in the sagittal plane,
Right.
which means, like, that's movement that you see when you look at a body from the side, so you could kinda picture that, but the knee does also rotate, and what that means is, like the lower leg or the tibia rotates relative to the femur, like rotation. And that's a transverse plane movement that you see if you were to look at the body from a bird's eye view and look down, then you would see that type of movement.
And it's pretty easy to see that on yourself, right? If you just hold your thigh still and
Yeah.
knee maybe bent is the easiest. And if you toe in and toe out, like
Yes.
that's what we're talking about.
That's right. That's the tibia rotating relative to the femur.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I meant for us to mention when we were talking about the anatomy and structure of the knee is, because I think it's related to this, is there are things in the knee joint called condyles. Do you know what condyles are, Travis? So like condyles are kind of these bony prominences on the end of bones. And so
Mm-hmm.
our femur, and you can probably anyone who just closes your eyes and pictures just like a femur bone. You know how the
Mm-hmm.
bottom of it has these two bulbous sides to it? It just kind of has the two sides. Those are the condyles of the femur. And then the tibia, which is the lower leg bone, also has condyles. They actually concave in, they don't convex
Mm-hmm.
out like the femur, but they're called condyles. And it's at
Tibial
those
plateau, maybe.
yeah, I think that's the tibial plateau, like the top of the tibia where the femur comes down. But the two condyles on either side, you have a medial and a lateral condyle of the femur and the tibia. Where those articulate, that's like what makes the tibiofemoral joint. But
Mm-hmm.
they're not necessarily symmetrical on each side. One of them, and I think it's the medial one, is longer than the lateral one. I'm pretty sure, but maybe don't quote me. One of them is longer than the other. So my understanding is that the reason that your tibia rotates is because in order to perform something that anatomy calls or biomechanics calls the screw home mechanism, So basically, what that is just that as you're walking around, as your knee straightens, so it's just in that range of motion from like 0 degrees of flexion to 30. It's like as the knee is straightening, then when you straighten, there's this screw home mechanism where it's kind of like the two leg bones, they kind of screw relative to one another. The tibia externally rotates and the femur internally rotates, and the reason that happens is that it helps create more congruency in the joint. And it also pulls the cruciate ligaments, the ACL and the PCL that we mentioned before. It pulls them tight. And all of that just gives the joint more stability. It's like what they call the close packed position of the knee joint is when it's straight like that. So hopefully
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't too complicated. But so that's like the screw home mechanism, like when you're straightening the knee. And then when you go to flex the knee again to rebend it, it screws in the opposite direction, or maybe it unscrews. It like reverses the screw home mechanism. So it's that rotational action in there that's about like up to 10 degrees of motion. That's kind of where this rotation that we're talking about of the knee comes in. Do you think do you know what I'm talking about? Should I
Yeah,
describe that
that
okay?
that sounds good.
So the knee does flexion and extension and rotation. So it's not purely a hinge joint, although it's kind of primarily a hinge joint. And then Travis, I don't know that these are really directions of motion, but these are two kind of important directional descriptions that we tend to hear that I was thinking you could describe for us, which is varus and valgus, right? With regard to
Mm-hmm.
the knee, like
Yeah.
what are varus and valgus?
Right. So we just talked about flexion extension and the rotation. Those are movements that we can like make volitionally or voluntarily with our like muscle contraction. But the
Mm-hmm.
valgus and varus are, and those are sagittal plane and transverse plane respectively. But the valgus and varus are really frontal plane movements that are are may, maybe less desirable, arguably, because they have been fear mongered before, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that we in our understanding today of those movements maybe isn't as, we're not as worried about them as maybe we were historically. But anyway,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
valgus is a knock knee position, and varus is a bow legged position. So
Mhm.
valgus would be your knees are going in towards each other, they're bowing in, which is a combination of hip adduction, hip internal rotation, and pronation at the foot. Also, maybe some tibial external rotation. And then varus would be all of the opposite. So knees are bowing apart or out from each other. The hip is externally rotating. The foot is supinating. And then the tibia is internally rotating. So those movements are controlled, or the excess varus and valgus are prevented by the MCL and LCL. So the MCL
Oh, those
on
ligaments.
the inside of the leg controls or resists valgus, and the LCL on the outside of the leg controls or resists or prevents excess varus. But usually
That's
those things are happening um, like when you, they could happen when you do something like squatting where your
mhm.
knees would knock inward.
That would be
They
valgus,
would,
right?
or they could happen if you're landing from a jump, or
Mhm.
maybe doing an athletic movement like where you're cutting or pivoting.
Mhm.
And so those, again, like historically have been very controversial, are still controversial, historically have been very, we've been
Red
very
X.
worried about them. Red X, yeah. And like myths in this podcast. I guess this maybe isn't, I don't know, it's not a myth, but we're coming around to the idea that maybe especially valgus isn't as dangerous or
Yeah.
worrisome as we once thought, especially for things like squats, but even for things like landing from jumps, where we thought, oh, if you land with a valgus knee position from a jump, then you're destined to tear your ACL. And that's really just hasn't been borne out in the research.
That makes a lot of sense, and you've actually covered that issue before in some of our content through Strength for Yoga, which has been really helpful. Yeah, so interesting to note, just like, I guess, ideas about different ways to move the body definitely have changed and evolved over time, and they will continue to do so. But interesting to note that perhaps valgus and varus maybe aren't movements that we need to worry so much about, or at least maybe not on like a super just general scale where we just say always, if you move that way, it's always bad.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to probably talk more about these two as we get into some of the yoga myths too, because yeah, there are cautions around that with certain asanas and alignments. But
Mm-hmm.
Travis, there was maybe one more thing, maybe before we start to talk a little more about like how you might load the knee and strengthen it. One
Mm-hmm.
more thing about just the way that the knee can move that I was wondering if you could describe for us, because this is a term that I think is important for us to know. But I feel like in yoga teacher trainings and in my experience, at least, it's not a term that we tend to learn about, maybe because it's just
Mm-hmm.
not relevant in that setting. But there is something, Travis, that's called terminal knee extension. Could you tell us what that is? What's terminal knee extension?
Sounds like a nasty disease, but it's actually not.
Terminal.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is
Terminal
that?
just means end. And
And
that, yeah, the idea of terminal knee extension is that we have some extension past 0 degrees. So when your
what's
knee is
zero? What's
straight,
0 degrees? That's
so zero,
straight.
so if you were neither flexed nor extended, your knee would be in 0 degrees of extension or 0 degrees of flexion. But terminal knee extension is the last 5 to 10 degrees of range of motion that we have into extension that actually takes the knee into hyperextension. So
Mm-hmm.
the knee is more extended than 0 degrees. And if you were looking at it from the side, then if the knee is bent, then the knee is in front of the hip and the ankle. But if
Mm-hmm.
the knee is hyperextended, then the knee is a little bit behind. And maybe you yourself have extra hyperextension that sometimes happens in people, or maybe you've seen it. Hyperextension is a good thing, and it's a normal thing, and again, it's usually 5 to 10 degrees, and it's something that actually, if you sustain a knee injury, oftentimes that hyperextension goes away. So you have
You lose that range of motion.
yeah, so you're limited and you need to get it back. And you can do various things, but one of them is stretching, where you're just
Mm-hmm.
cranking, not cranking, that kind of sounds bad, but you're gently pulling the knee in towards
Into
hyperextension.
hyperextension.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which isn't a stretch that we do regularly, but there are
Right.
instances following, like during knee injury rehabilitation, where you actually do need to restore that, and it's really important that you do. And if you don't, then you can be more at risk for future injury. Your gait can be, your walking, running can be compromised if you don't have those couple 5 to 10 degrees of hyperextension.
That is really helpful. Thank you so much for describing that. So we are planning in our next episode to address quote locking out the knee in yoga,
Mm-hmm.
because that's something that we tend to hear a lot of cueing and language around, like whether or not to lock the knees. But I thought it was helpful to kind of introduce this idea of terminal knee extension here when we're just kind of introducing the foundations of the knee and how it moves. And important, you pointed out already, but I think sometimes we learn to like fear or believe that it's bad to take our joints into like hyperextension. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
often like these ideas that if your knee bends back, further than zero, that's just inherently bad and we shouldn't do it. But according to what you just said and to what I read in my research leading up to this episode, it's completely normal. And like you said, kind of important to have that up to 5 to 10 degrees of
Mm-hmm.
hyperextension, of ability to bend the knee
Yeah.
backwards.
And I just remembered maybe a better way to show it or see it on yourself. If you were sitting in staff pose and
Mm-hmm.
you fully straightened your knee towards the floor, your heel would actually lift off the ground
Yes,
just
that would be
a very, very little
hyperextension.
bit. And so you could kind of do that on your right side and your left side and see that you can do it. Um, or if you can't, then maybe you're limited.
Right. That's a good way to like test it on yourself. And yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning. That's a good demonstration idea. But yeah, so maybe with kind of all of that laid out is just the anatomy, the way the knee joint is laid out, the way things articulate and move. And we've actually touched a tiny bit on strengthening the knee, but maybe we talk about like loading the knee and how we might, like, if that's important to us, if we want to build strength in the knee, how
Mm-hmm.
we might think about doing that. Um, and we could kind of like, we were going to maybe do strength training, talk about that first, and then talk about yoga, but we could kind of blend it all together because it can kind of, it's all related.
For
But
sure.
like in like a strength training context, Travis, what would be some classic ways that say you just want to build stronger knees? Like, what do you do?
Yeah. So you would do typically knee extension exercises or exercises characterized by knee extension. And that could
Mm-hmm.
be isolated knee extension, like a knee extension machine, or
Mm-hmm.
it could be integrated or what we would call a compound movement where the knee is extending and the hip is extending at the same
Like a
time,
squat.
like a squat or a step up or a lunge
Uh-huh.
or a split squat or a wall sit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think that covers most of them.
That seems like a really thorough list to me. Yeah. Yeah, and those are all strengthening knee extension, which by definition means they're strengthening the quads, right? Since the quadriceps are the
Mm-hmm.
muscles that perform that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like we kind of already established, that's kind of the classic way we tend to learn about how to strengthen the knee. But like, what if we wanted to broaden our definition of knee strength and think backside of the knee, and
Mm-hmm.
hamstrings, therefore, at least hamstrings in the knee dominant sense of strengthening? Like, what would you do in a strength training context
Yeah. So if you wanted to strengthen knee flexion, then that would be the hamstring curl.
that you described
Or
earlier?
yeah, or you could do an exercise called a supine hip extension leg curl. So that would be where, let's say you had we call them hamstring bridge slides in strength for
Oh,
yoga.
in strength for yoga,
Yeah.
yes, bridge slides, yes.
Yeah. So you're performing a bridge. So your hip is extending, and then your feet or heels are on a sliding surface like a yoga blanket or furniture sliders or an
Mm-hmm.
exercise ball
Mm-hmm.
or the stirrups of a TRX suspension trainer. There are a million ways to do this,
There really are, yeah.
or just socks on a
Mhm.
hardwood floor. But so you're bridging and then you're pulling your heels in as you bridge up.
And that would be contracting the hamstrings concentrically as you pull your feet in, and
Mm-hmm.
that would be like this knee dominant way to target the hamstrings and therefore the back of the knee and to strengthen them.
Yes.
Awesome. And then, hey, do you think this would also count potentially as knee strengthening and targeting the hamstring? So you mentioned bridge slides, which that would be open chain and open chain movement, right? Open chain is when the distal end of the limb is fixed.
Yeah,
I mean, sorry,
you're
is
right.
free to move, is free to move. And then closed chain is the opposite. So actually, we wanted to mention this when we talked about how the knee moves open versus closed. Um, maybe to think about knee extension, actually just shifting direction a bit. If you think of kicking a soccer ball,
Hmm.
kicking, that would be using your quadriceps. You're extending the knee to kick the ball, and that would be open chain because the foot is free to move as you kick the ball. But if you were to have your feet planted and maybe you hold a weight, maybe you don't, and you do squats, then your feet are fixed to the floor and then you're bending and straightening your knees. So that would be knee extension exercise that's closed chain because the distal end of the limb is fixed. Right? Right,
Yep.
Travis?
Yep. And so the same thing can apply with the knee flexion. If the bridge slide would be a closed chain, but an
Open,
open
right?
chain would be a leg curl on
Wait,
a machine.
bridge slide. Oh, wait, I was going to say bridge
Oh,
slide would
I'm
be
sorry.
open.
I screwed it up. The they're
I think
both
both of those
open
were
chain.
open, right?
They're both
Yeah.
open chain. There is a closed chain.
Well, that's what I was just going to bring up. That's what I was,
Okay.
yeah. Let's see if
Okay.
we're going to say the same thing. What are you going to say is closed
I was
chain?
gonna say the body curl.
Oh, I was going to say the Nordic hamstring curl.
Yeah, that too.
Both of those. You know what? I thought of the body curl, Travis, for this episode, but I just thought it was a little complicated to
Oh,
explain. So I
it's
was
it's
like,
convoluted.
so like when we can't demo, it's a little tough to just describe.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
we could say it. The body curl is like the opposite of a bridge slide, right? Where your feet
Yeah.
are fixed and then your body is on something that slides and then you push, right?
Hmm. And it's really hard.
It's super. We have a video actually where you teach me
Hmm.
doing that, and
Hmm.
it's hard.
And
And
we
then the
had you do it
Nordic,
because I can't actually do it.
right? You can't. You mean you can? Did you say you cannot do it? Is that what you
No,
said?
no.
Right. It's hard. So you could see that would be closed chain. If you can picture what we're saying, it's a little tricky to picture, but your feet would be planted on the floor and then you slide the rest of your body back and forth. But then
Hmm.
a Nordic hamstring curl, we've talked about that on the podcast before too, but that's another example of closed chain for the hamstrings, for the back of the knee, where you kneel and either a friend comes up and pushes your feet down to keep them anchored, or you hook your feet like under some contraption to keep them anchored. And then you lean your torso forward, which is going to load the hamstrings eccentrically. That's a
Hmm.
Nordic hamstring curl. So that's also closed chain because the rest of your body is moving, right, relative to the.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah. So just to both explain the difference between open and closed when we're thinking about the knee and to give examples of how to strengthen the knee, how we might think about doing that. I think these are all some good examples. And those are all good from like the strength training world. But since this is a yoga podcast, we have a lot of people who love strength and we talk about it a lot anyway. But yoga maybe has some overlap with strength, but is also quite different. So if we were interested in, I'm going to just say kind of loosely, like targeting the knees, because that's a whole other conversation as to whether we actually strengthen them in yoga.
Hmm.
Right. But if you just wanted to load the knees or work the knees, like what do we do in a yoga asana context that might like target the knees?
Chair pose for sure.
Yes.
And
Yes.
any of our forward or side facing standing poses
Yeah.
like warrior one and high
Hmm.
lunge and warrior two. And what else?
Those are honestly, I think that like standing poses and chair pose are kind
Hmm.
of maybe another, this is kind of a random one, but like it's not a classic yoga asana, but sometimes like if you're in down dog and you want to do, sometimes they're called like donkey kicks where you're just going to hop repeatedly up toward a bent knee handstand. Like you're springing up
Oh,
over and over,
that's a
like you're down
nice
dog, you bend your
one.
knees, you spring up into like a, you're in a handstand, but like your knees stay like tucked and then you come right back down. Um,
That's so
those
clever.
are, yeah, like little bent kneed handstand hops. I guess the knees don't have to stay bent, but in my mind, usually I think of they stay bent and then you fall back down. So that would be you're kicking off the ground using your
Hmm.
quadriceps, right? To spring up.
Hmm.
So
Totally.
that's like a way to load. Oh, and then this is not a classic yoga asana, but it's one that we sometimes see, and I tend to teach this in my classes. Bear pose, right?
Right.
What's bear pose?
Bear pose is like tabletop or quadruped with your knees hovered a couple of inches off the floor, which is
Yeah,
basically isometric knee extension. And we
that's
can
right.
move into and out of that shape and target the knees in a few different
Mm-hmm.
ways,
Mm-hmm.
such as if we were to go from bear to downward dog with
Mm-hmm.
2 legs or 1 leg, that would be a good opportunity to target the knees or the quads in
Mm-hmm.
particular.
I think that's a great example. And we've kind of just mentioned, once again, defaulting to the idea of strengthening the knees being all about the quads. We've kind of mentioned a bunch of
Right.
quad examples, but like, and this is something, Travis, we talk about a lot with our work. And it's actually why we created our hamstring strengthening program that we have, that 5 weeks to strong and flexible hamstrings, which we'll
Mm-hmm.
put the link in the show notes for anyone who's interested. Because in a yoga context, we don't really strengthen the quads very well either, but we don't target the hamstrings or strengthen them in a yoga
Yeah,
context very much.
especially knee flexion.
You're
Like
right.
there
Maybe a
might
little
be
more on the hip side.
couple examples, like Purvottanasana, right? That's
Hmm.
a pretty good. That's pretty tough for the
Yes.
hamstrings, but that's the hip extension action.
Yes.
So yeah, unless you're doing bridge slides in your yoga classes, there's
Which is
probably
rare.
not much knee flexion strengthening. You might
That's
like, I don't know. There's probably some yoga pose where you flex the knee, like,
right.
oh,
Against
I was
resistance.
thinking, yeah, I was
Well,
thinking of bow, but you're just like,
it's not
oh, wait, no, definitely not bow, because you're actually you're
because you
kicking
kick
into
your
your
feet into your
hands,
hands.
yeah, which
Yeah.
is a good quad strengthener, sort of good
Well, maybe
quad
it
targeter.
activates the quads. Yeah.
It activates, yeah. Um, Shalabhasana,
Oh,
where you
yes.
bend and
Bend
straighten
and
the
straighten
leg.
your knees.
You're
Yes.
flexing the knee against gravity, so the weight of your shin,
Hmm.
which is not a lot, but when you're already in hip extension, it can be tough
Yes, totally.
if you do a bunch of them, right?
I totally agree. That's actually a move that I've often taught in my classes, and I like to place a block between the ankles and just kind of hug in, just for a little more like
Mm.
stability between the legs, and then lift up into Shalabhasana and then bend and straighten. You don't have to
Hmm.
have the block. I like it for a little more control,
Hmm.
but it's a great way to really wake up the hamstrings. But Travis, so I think that that's me. I know there are more we could go into, but we don't have
Yeah,
all the time
maybe
in the world today.
one more just to
Yeah.
briefly mention, because it is a yoga pose, is camel, and in particular, so the way that we traditionally do
Oh.
camel is more of a passive, like you have to control the getting into the pose, the transition from
Mhm.
kneeling to getting into camel, and then once you're there, I guess it's more, would you say it's more of a stretch?
Yeah, I don't really think yoga's camel is really strengthening for the
Right,
quads or
yeah.
hamstrings.
Right.
But
But if you were to do it in such a way that you repeatedly leaned into and out of camel, maybe
mhm.
with a not quite camel shape, but keeping your hip extended and not
Keep your spine more
going into a
neutral.
back bend, yeah, then if you can imagine that, then that's a really tough
It's
quadriceps
really
exercise.
hard. And that's an exercise we include in strength for yoga. We call it a camel lean back. You start kneeling and you
Hmm.
basically just tip back. Like your shins stay down, but you tip everything back, and that totally loads the quads. And tell me if I'm wrong, Travis, but in the strength training world, I think that has a few different names, but it's sometimes called a
Yeah,
reverse Nordic. A
I've
reverse
heard it
because it's
called
kind of
that.
the
Yeah.
opposite of the Nordic that we just described earlier.
Hmm. I've also seen it called a natural leg extension, but I like our name the best.
Yes. Me too. It's a camel lean back for us, for the strength for yoga community. But
Yeah.
that is a really good way to strengthen the knees and load the quads that you could do in yoga. It's a variation like for yoga. It's not traditional, but you could bring that in.
Hmm.
So hopefully those suggestions just give our listeners an idea of like how you might feel, like what you need to do to kind of target the knees, to get the muscles that cross the knees to work against resistance. Those are kind of ways you'd want to orient your body with relation to gravity to make that happen. But
Hmm.
maybe we could shift our attention to just touching on a few common knee conditions, because I know
Let's do
people
it.
wonder about that. And we have some good stuff to talk about this.
Cool.
I had a little list of some to go. Oh yeah, some to go over. So we know everything we said about the knees. And we talked about the ligaments. We mentioned the meniscus, the knee meniscus. Maybe really quickly to bring that up again. Those are like two fibrocartilage, crescent-shaped kind of pads in the knee that
Mm-hmm.
sit on the, Travis, you said it before, the tibial plateau. They kind of sit there and they help to kind of raise the tibia up a little higher to just help give more surface for the femur to articulate with.
Mm-hmm.
And they also serve as like shock absorption, the
Yeah.
menisci do. And we have two, we have a medial and a lateral one. And the
Mm-hmm.
medial meniscus is one that tends to kind of tear semi commonly, right? Because here's the deal. This is hugely important, I think, to lay a context for these conditions we're going to touch on is that there's a really, I know there's more research than just this, but this was a pretty recent study that I found from 2020 that's titled Prevalence of Abnormal Findings in 230 Knees of Asymptomatic Adults
Mm-hmm.
using 3.0T MRI, which that's MRI is a type of imaging. And I believe the 3.0T is like a higher quality image. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, this was a study in which they looked at 115 people and then two knees on each person. So 230 knees. They
I
were
was wondering
asymptomatic.
if it was
It was, yeah.
115 times 2. It's a good way to double
Yes.
your knees.
Exactly. 115 subjects, 230 knees. And all of these subjects, they had no pain. That's what asymptomatic means. So they were
Mm-hmm.
pain-free individuals. Median age was 44 years old. And basically, what this study suggested, and this is not the only one to show this, but the study showed that 97% of the knees, so nearly all of the knees of asymptomatic adults, remember they have no pain, showed abnormalities in at least one knee structure on MRI. So when the knee was imaged, it uncovered that at least one structure in all of the knee, well, 97% of the knees had some abnormality. And these findings included meniscal tears, which we just mentioned, cartilage abnormalities, bone marrow edema, and tendon and ligament abnormalities.
What's the deal with that?
I
How
don't know,
could they be
Travis.
pain-free?
And have these like what might be labeled damage, but what I think more optimistic people would call just changes, like joint changes.
It's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah, because I think we just know that as the human body ages, we naturally have like joint changes inside, changes to our joint structure. And these changes may or may not be connected to pain. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. And this type of research that looks at asymptomatic bodies and reveals that there's actually what might be considered damage or abnormalities inside. I mean, if 97% of the knees had what's called an abnormality, is that really an abnormality or is it just normal? I don't
Yeah,
know.
good question.
But I think it's important to point that out because, and this is a theme that runs across really the whole body. Like there's research on the shoulder and on the spine that show, and the hip that show very similar things, like quote abnormalities in these areas, but the people are pain free. So just
Mm-hmm.
kind of pointing to that thing that we talk about a lot on the podcast, that pain and like the state of your tissues don't necessarily correlate always on a one-to-one basis. And you can have
Mm-hmm.
joint changes and have no pain. And clearly that was the case for all these people that were in this study. And I just think that's important because like we were just talking about meniscal tears, tears of the meniscus. And in this study, 90, sorry, I had the number here. It was 93% of the meniscal tears were the medial meniscus. So just
Mm-hmm.
further adding to that, it's usually the medial one. Sometimes the lateral meniscus is torn. But I think it's been pretty well established, Travis, in research. And I know you reviewed a study on this in Physio Network that I found when I
Mm-hmm.
was researching this about medial meniscus surgery, like surgery for medial meniscus tears. Do you
Mm-hmm.
remember, if not that specific study that you reviewed, do you remember the just kind of general consensus these days about surgery for medial meniscus?
Yeah. So surgery for meniscus tears is a fairly widespread practice, and
Mm-hmm.
they there are other body parts and surgeries where there's been evolving or emerging evidence showing that the surgeries are really not necessary. And
Mm-hmm.
what they'll do and what they did in this study is they'll compare, or actually, no, sorry, they didn't do it in this study. In the other studies, they'll sometimes compare a surgery to a sham surgery, where in one group they'll do the surgery and in another group they won't do the surgery, but the people won't know whether they had it or whether they didn't, which like kind of crazy, but they open you up and then
Totally.
they close you
Yeah,
back
they do
up.
go in, but then they don't make the actual change, right?
Yeah. And I think a good example of that might be for the on the scapula, like an
The acromion.
acromioplasty,
We
right?
talked about this on the podcast actually
Yeah.
several
Episode
episodes ago.
number.
I don't
Yeah.
remember. Oh, it was down
Anyway,
dog. It was the down dog episode, and the cue about we should always externally rotate the shoulders in down dog. That's what it
yeah.
was.
So anyway, the point is that there are these other surgeries that have been shown that they're no better than not doing the surgery at all. And
Mm-hmm.
what this one study did was they compared surgery to physical therapy, and
Mm-hmm.
they also had a group of people who they were the people who did physical therapy were allowed to later select that they wanted the surgery, but they followed the people for 2 years, and they found that really at no time point was surgery better than no surgery. And they looked
Right.
at a
Right.
gazillion different measures. I forget what the main outcome was, whether it was disability, or I think that's probably what it was, or like not yeah, knee function, pain, whatever it was. It basically goes to show that you probably don't need surgery, and they had shown this before in older populations, older
Right.
adults. But this study was actually, I forget exactly what the median age was, but it was younger people, and some of them were pretty active. Like it included
Mm-hmm.
some high level athletes. So it challenges the idea that this is something that you absolutely need surgery for. And my take on it is kind of like, if you, because there's no difference,
Mm-hmm.
you could get surgery or not get surgery, and you should probably do what you want to do.
Yeah.
But the surgeons probably shouldn't push one or another,
Yes.
because there's just no compelling evidence that the surgery is necessary. So from a medical usage standpoint, we should maybe stop doing it, except in some cases. And that's the tricky part, because what we really want to know is, well, which people need, which
Yeah.
subpopulations of people, what other factors about them would suggest that they're going to be good or worse candidates for surgery, and we don't know that yet. But
Right.
basically my recommendation would be, like, if you want surgery and your expectation is that surgery will help, then that's fine, but it's not,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need it, and if you don't need it, then we shouldn't push it.
I love that. That sounds like a really kind of reasoned take, because I guess I do. I think when we learn about these like sham surgeries that are done that often perform no better, or that the real surgery performs no better than sham, it can be
Mm-hmm.
easy to just be like, then no one should ever get surgery. It's just like, let's take it off the table. And that seems like that's going too far in that direction. Like,
I think
there
so.
may well be instances where the surgery could actually be the thing the person needs. But I think, like you said, to just maybe a shift away from medical practitioners pushing surgery when it really may not be necessary. Like, we have more options.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, if you're a surgeon who does these surgeries,
Mm-hmm. If
that could
that's
be
your
a tough pill to
career.
swallow. Yeah, because you
Yeah,
make your
man.
money when you operate on people. And
Um,
again, it's not worse, but it's just not better either than not
that's right.
operating.
But Travis, can we talk about knee osteoarthritis
Mm-hmm.
briefly?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think this is a really interesting topic. So knee osteoarthritis is another potential condition of the knee That's pretty common, pretty common. And whereas the meniscus tear and meniscus issues that we were kind of just talking about, so that's in the fibrocartilage pad in the knee joint. Osteoarthritis has more to do with the hyaline cartilage that surrounds the bones inside the joint. And
Mm-hmm.
osteoarthritis it's basically like when that cartilage degrades. And this condition, like I said, is pretty common. It's important to I think it's helpful to distinguish it from rheumatoid arthritis, which is a different type
Mm-hmm.
of arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is a systemic autoimmune disease, which is like this inflammatory disease, and it's a lot more rare. Rheumatoid arthritis is more rare than osteoarthritis. Rheumatoid is like 1% or less of the population, but
Mm-hmm.
osteoarthritis is much more common. And when it's rheumatoid arthritis, that generally targets the hands and feet. And typically it's treated, it's so there's no cure, but like the symptoms are managed through like medication, and
Right.
exercise is actually really recommended for this population. But to maybe just be cautious during like a flare up or something. Maybe not so much then, but in general, exercise is good with rheumatoid arthritis.
Mm-hmm.
But then osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis also, so it can create pain and discomfort in the joints. But from what I understand, it targets specifically more the synovial membrane of the joint, whereas osteoarthritis is more the cartilage. But all in all, they both kind of sum up to the joints feel discomfort, but just as far
Mm-hmm.
as like the specific tissue that gets targeted. So, osteoarthritis is the most common type of arthritis. Something like 32 million people in the US have osteoarthritis. And the thing that I think is important to realize is that there are big misconceptions about osteoarthritis. Like we tend to learn, and I think most people believe that it's a wear and tear condition that's like has
Mm-hmm.
to do with like how you've loaded your joints and you've basically like worn your joints down over time. And that used to be, I think, what like the medical world used to believe and what they would say about it. But we actually know today that osteoarthritis is a much more complex disease, and it can involve like the cartilage degradation, or it generally does. But mechanical and movement inputs are really not playing a major role in that happening. It's more like on this molecular level that it's taking place. So I think that's like this big disassociation that would be helpful for us to start to make is to, if you do have some cartilage degradation in, say, your knee joint, which as we know, many people who have no pain do have cartilage degeneration. Like you can have those changes and have no pain. But just if you do happen to have that and an MRI shows it, it doesn't mean necessarily that you like loaded your joints wrong or poorly, and that you created that because of the way you moved. Like it's not really
Mm-hmm.
about that. And additionally, when someone has osteoarthritis, moving the body and loading the joint is actually not bad for the joint. And I think that's like a huge realization, because when we believe
Yeah.
that it's a wear and tear joint, we then believe, therefore, we shouldn't load the joint anymore. And
Right.
that's what so many people, they just stop moving. They're like afraid, especially when it's knees, because, that's such a weight bearing joint. And so many of our movements like directly load the knees. So historically, doctors will tell patients things like, you have osteoarthritis, it's bone on bone, and it's wear and tear, and it's just going to get worse. All these things that are just so negative and we're learning are really just not true, and that there are like a ton of misconceptions about it. So I think
Mm-hmm.
something that's super encouraging to know is that when we have osteoarthritis, it's very established and recommended today in the medical world, that exercise is actually really good for pain, osteoarthritis pain, really helpful. Not necessarily that it's like making your joint structure better. It may, but we don't really have research to support that exercise improves the joint structure, but it just helps with so much else in like the bigger picture, and
Yeah.
can be really, and it doesn't hurt the joints anymore. Exercise doesn't. So there's a really cool study that I just want to really quickly touch on that was done just a couple of years ago. And this study is called The Effect of High Intensity Strength Training on Knee Pain and knee joint compressive forces among adults with knee osteoarthritis. This was the START randomized clinical trial. I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. And it was huge. It had 377 subjects, which is pretty big. And they did these strength training interventions for 18 months. So it was also really long. And they
Yeah.
basically had subjects who were all over 60 years of age, and they all had knee osteoarthritis and they all had pain. And it was 3 groups. One group did high intensity strength training, like 90% of their 1RM, which is like very high. One group did low intensity strength training. And then the other group was like this education group. They considered it the control, where they just received like regular education in a group setting over the 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
So, Travis, do you know what happened in that study?
I do. All of the groups had reduced pain,
That's
including
right,
the control group. But
including the control
yeah,
group.
so it's good to know. But it also, I think what we're trying to point out here is that both the high intensity and low intensity resistance training improved pain,
That's
but
right.
also that the education improved pain
Also
as well.
improved
So
pain. That's right.
maybe all of the above would
Which
be
is
the
exciting.
yeah.
Like so
But
many
it,
options, right?
combine many options, maybe combining resistance training, high or low intensity with education.
Could be excellent. And I think that, just like you said, the fact that all 3 groups improved by the end is really encouraging. Like, so we therefore have, if you like to strength train with heavy loads, that's good. But I think the other important thing out of the study for our conversation is that the high intensity strength training people, they did not experience more cartilage degeneration as a result of the
Yeah,
training. So I think
that
that's
is
important.
great.
So I think that's what people are afraid of, right? They think their knee is fragile or vulnerable and they can't load it. But as we see here with all of these subjects who all had knee osteoarthritis, they high intensity strength trained and they didn't worsen the condition of the joint.
Hmm.
I feel like for a lot of people that'd be kind of mind blowing.
Yeah, for sure. That's the total paradigm shift and an encouraging paradigm shift.
Exactly. People should feel encouraged. That's the evidence-based treatment for these days for osteoarthritis is exercise, and like maybe some medication and things like that. But it's not to like protect the joint because it wasn't really mechanical loads that created the osteoarthritis, and more mechanical loading isn't going to like worsen it.
Hmm.
It probably can help. Oh
Hmm.
yeah, and also aerobic exercise is also recommended. Like running. Like you would think maybe running wouldn't be good like for knee osteoarthritis, but it seems apparently according to research it's fine. So
Mind
like you said,
blown.
paradigm shift. I know. So Travis, we could probably talk so much more about the knee, but maybe we should wrap this up.
Yeah.
Do you think? I think we covered like a lot of what we intended to set out, and we have a lot of myths to look at in our upcoming second episode. So hopefully this gives our listeners a nice solid foundation as far as the knee, how it moves, how we might load it, and a couple common conditions and maybe some paradigm shifts around them.
Yeah. We're primed for myth busting now.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for talking to me about the knee today.
Thank you, Jenny.